Hi folks, welcome to RJA Impact. Today we're going to be talking about week 11 in the Holmes Theranos trial. You can search this channel for previous week's updates and also for a more detailed video on the background to Theranos and Holmes' journey to the point at which this trial commenced. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and also hit the notification button so that you don't miss out on any future videos. Now, as a reminder, Elizabeth Holmes is in court accused of multiple instances of fraud against doctors, patients and investors in connection with her role as CEO of Theranos, and this is week 10 of that trial.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Before we talk about this week's testimony and goings on at the trial, we'll take a little diversion with the background section. Background bonus. We've heard from whistleblowers in prior weeks' testimonies, and I've mentioned it more than once that Holmes and Theranos actively pursued with full legal force employees who they suspected of having been one of those and had raised issues about the company. We now know the names and sources for John Carreyrou's exposés. He was the Wall Street Journal journalist who wrote a series of exposés starting in 2015, and I want to home in on one aspect of one of these. Now, as these whistleblowers were really instrumental in uncovering the Theranos deception and ultimately got us to the position where we face this trial today, I think it's important to hear some of the impact that this had on them personally. At the risk of preempting his trial testimony, as he is one of the witnesses that the prosecution could call, I'm going to talk about Tyler Schultz. Now, he's the grandson of George Schultz, who was a board member of the company. Tyler managed to get a job with Theranos and worked there for about 8 months. He has talked about his realisation that the company was making claims about its tech that went far beyond its actual capabilities, and this is why he decided to leave and become one of Carreyrou's sources. So, at around the time he left, he decided to speak with George Schultz to convey his concerns, and this was supposed to be a grandson-grandfather chat in George's house, and we can hear what happened when Tyler met George. Now, I've extracted about a minute from an interview held at the Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University in 2018 on the basis of fair comment, and I'll put a link to the full interview in the video description below, and it is well worth a watch.
And I just felt like I have so much power right now, because when Theranos first thought that I'd spoken to the Wall Street Journal, they had my grandfather call me, and I ended up going to his house just to talk to my grandfather, and I explicitly said I want to talk to my grandfather without lawyers, because it was clear at that point that Theranos wanted me to talk to their lawyers, and I said, I want to come talk to you, not to lawyers. So I went to his house, and I rehashed all of these old conversations that I had with him, where I said this thing is, doesn't exist essentially, and we're giving patients bad results. We're not testing on the Theranos devices, but he didn't believe me. And then he just said that there was a one-page confidentiality agreement, and if I agreed to sign it, that a world of trouble would go away. And I said, okay, I'll sign a one-page confidentiality agreement. And then he said, actually, there are 2 lawyers here right now. Can I go get them? And I said, okay. And so these lawyers come in, and they don't give me a one-page confidentiality agreement. They give me a temporary restraining order letter signed by David Boyce. I don't remember exactly what was in the letter, but it was basically like, you're a terrible person, signed David Boyce. So this was nothing like a one-page confidentiality agreement.
Or just to talk with your grandfather.
Yeah, or just to talk with my grandfather. This was nothing like what I had expected.
What's interesting to me is that Tyler doesn't seem to hold this meeting against his grandfather, and later in that interview he goes on to say how his grandfather had spoken about him in glowing terms as somebody who essentially knew right from wrong and stuck with the right. To me, the earlier meeting, including the legal ambush, would have been straining on a family relationship to say the least. And so to the trial. Catching up from last week, we actually had a Thursday testimony, which is one of the ways Judge Davila has tried to speed things along. Chris Lucas. On Thursday, we had the testimony of Chris Lucas. Now, if you remember, we heard about Lucas from an earlier testimony of Brian Tolbert, an investor who had paid Lucas $125,000 for introducing Tolbert's Hall Group to Theranos. Lucas had put in about $7.3 million in total into Theranos over a period of time. His last investment through Black Diamond Ventures of $5.3 million is actually one of the wire transfer counts mentioned in the indictment. And the prosecution took a now familiar path, as they have with other investors, which boils down to identifying the alleged lies he was told by Holmes and his ultimate decision to invest as a result. He said Holmes made claims about Theranos technology that turned out not to be true. For example, that their analyzers were able to do most commercially available tests, and that they were endorsed by pharmaceutical companies, and they were being used by the military. Now, he said he didn't know the company was using modified third-party machines to do its testing. Dr. Lynette Sawyer. Lynette was the lab director who came to the company in late 2014 after Rosendorf left the job, and at the same time that Balwani hired his acquaintance Sunil Dhawan to be the lab director. She quit in June 2015 after only 6 months. As that time wore on and I grew increasingly uncomfortable with the way things were done, Dr. Sawyer testified, I was uncomfortable with the lack of clarity about the lab. When she told Balwani she was quitting, she said it was a little uncomfortable because he was a bit pushy about it. Most bizarrely, she said she never saw a Theranos blood testing device, never reviewed data from a Theranos device, never spoke to a co-director, never had contact with lab supervisors, and she was never invited to visit the lab, she said. She said that her job was to sign papers that were sent to her electronically, and she had to review and approve lab standard operating procedures and test validations. But they were only related to tests done on the standard commercial analyzers that Theranos also used. She never saw a Theranos device. Her role was, here is the document, sign it, she said. Before the jurors were called in on Tuesday, we had wranglings between the defence and the prosecution on two connected matters. The first was about the extent of the testimony of Dr. Kingshuk Das. Now, Das was the lab director who took over in the fall of 2015 after Lynette Sawyer and Sunil Dhawan had both left. The second related matter was about the amount of evidence that could be discussed in regards to the scathing CMS, that's Centre for Medicaid and Medicare Services report. Essentially, Das had a significant role in addressing the concerns in the report, and the government are saying that they intend to ask him about Holmes' pushback on Das's conclusions and her ideas for responding to it. The defence say that it should only be let into court if at least one of its authors from CMS take the stand too. Dr. Das was actually the person who made the decision to void all Theranos tests run on its own devices. Unpicking all this, essentially I think what the prosecution are trying to do is reinforce what Holmes knew about the accuracy problems of Theranos systems, at least in 2016. Courtroom hiccup. Oh dear. Just as things were getting going on Tuesday, we had another courtroom failure. As all the electronics for the projectors and courtroom tech were being reset, they failed. Lights would dim and darken from time to time as the equipment was being tested. Eventually, a return to the basics with an old-style projector brought in as backup and a lamp for the witness stand for when the courtroom lights are dimmed. We saw a little of the human side of Judge De Villa after this when he said he's very embarrassed about the problems. I'm sorry, he said. Dr. Lynette Sawyer. Eventually, we had a continuation of the testimony from Sawyer from last week. While we heard about the lack of Lynette's direct involvement in the lab from the prosecution, the defence sought to show that this was fairly normal. In fact, it's fairly common for Lynette's consulting firm to provide temporary lab directors on a short-term basis. Lance Wade for the defence established that her terms of contract were for $3,500 per month, and she expected her role to be part-time and a limited assignment, and that it was common for her to work as a lab director for several companies at once in this respect. Wade also pushed the fact that Sawyer's direct contact was with Balwani, and hence it follows their theme that it was Balwani and the lab directors who were at fault for all the lab issues. Wade was also able to establish that Sawyer did not know what a nanotainer was, although she'd actually signed one document in 2015 that's had the word nanotainer on it. Although she'd tried to make changes to documents, she couldn't, and resorted to emailing her contact at Theranos instead, she testified. Dr. Kingshuk Das. So at lunch we did get to hear from Das, the lab director who actually stayed with the company from 2016 until the time that it was wrapping up and the company then fired him. After a bit of background, it was established that Das was responsible for addressing the issues in the CMS report, and we had a slow burn build-up by Robert Leach for the prosecution as he asked Das to read aloud from regulations by the CMS. As soon as the prosecution entered the first 4 pages from the CMS report, the defence objected. We have a game of chess going on between the prosecution and defence on the amount of material that will be allowed in court in respect of that document, and to continue along the lines of that analogy, we have the first piece taken by the prosecution as Davila overruled and allowed the pages to be omitted. Now, Das reported directly to Holmes and had many meetings with her and even travelled to Washington with her to address the CMS report. Eventually we got there when Das testified that he had told Holmes about errors he'd found in the data from Theranos own devices. Apparently, women had been testing positive for a prostate-specific antigen that should only ever be found in men and associated with cancer. Holmes tried to say that it wasn't the Theranos machines at fault, and instead perhaps the women had a rare form of breast cancer. It seemed implausible, Das said. These machines were malperforming from the beginning, he testified. He then made the decision to void 2 years of tests, even though Holmes pushed back, blaming the quality control issues instead. The tests were voided, and Theranos never used the Edison again. We heard at close on Tuesday that 50 to 60,000 results were sent to doctors and patients, simply stating that the original tests were voided. On Wednesday, Das took the stand again, with the defence taking their turn at cross-examination. Essentially, the defence made the point that he was brought in as an expert to provide the technical support necessary for Holmes, as she only had a year of college education. He said that he was supported by Holmes in that role to the extent that she agreed in the decision to finally void all the tests and close down another lab that was having quality issues. Alan Eisenman. Alan was another investor who'd invested over $1 million in total in Theranos. Again, we heard that he relied on Holmes for information about Theranos and that he was impressed with the board members, the fact that Big Pharma, including Pfizer, had contracts with Theranos, and that they were projecting $200 million in revenues in 2008. One key discrepancy we heard about was that he was told Theranos would be cash flow positive by around 2010, and he put in another $100,000 as a result. However, Theranos' internal forecasts show that they expected the first substantial revenues in 2016, about 8 years after Eisenman expected it. This testimony follows a similar pattern that we heard about from previous investor testimonies. CMS report. The prosecution have released the CMS documents we heard about during the testimony of Das, which I can now look at. The report is probably best summarised by looking at the accompanying letter. After the introductory paragraph, it gets straight to the point. Your facility is not in compliance. The deficient practices of the laboratory pose immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. Immediate corrective action is necessary. In addition, other standards were also found not to be met. The letter goes on to state that the laboratory has 10 calendar days to provide credible allegation of compliance and acceptable evidence of correction. Now, also included in the CMS documents are the statements of deficiencies. 16 pages in total, and here is an example of one page that Theranos were obliged, as you can see in the second column, to respond with their corrective actions. The last document released relating to this is an extract from the response to the report itself, the patient impact assessment. Just glancing through this, we can see phrases like, therefore, the laboratory has concluded that there is a possible patient impact reported from the laboratory's TPS 3.5 instruments. And vitally, underpinning a lot of prior testimony, we have, out of an abundance of caution, the laboratory has voided all patient test results reported from the TPS 3.5 instruments. Now, the TPS 3.5s are the Edison machines. This then is the point at which a decade of development crashed. So that's it for week 11. We are going to have a very busy week next week because Judge Davila has said the court will hear testimony during all 5 days. And also, somewhat surprisingly, to me at least, the prosecution have said that they may be able to wrap things up by the end of next week, which would then bring us to the defence witnesses the week after. As usual, we'll boil down the week in court to the bare essentials. Week 11 in a nutshell. We had Chris Lucas from the investing Talbot Group. They had made a $7.3 million investment, and he testified that Holmes made claims about Theranos technology that turned out not to be true. For example, Theranos analyzers were able to do most commercially available tests, and that Theranos was endorsed by pharmaceutical companies, and also that Theranos devices were used by the military. Lynette Sawyer. She was a lab director during 2015 and testified that she was uncomfortable about the lab and its processes. She quit after 6 months and had very little direct contact with Theranos Labs and its employees. Now, the defence made the point that this light touch lab director role was in fact normal. Dr. Kinshuk Das. He was the lab director that took over from Lynette and was responsible for dealing with issues raised in the CMS report. He testified that the Theranos machines were effectively malperforming from the start and was responsible for voiding 2 years of tests, even though Holmes pushed back. Now, the defence identified areas of his work where Holmes had actually supported his decisions. Alan Eisman. Alan was another investor who had invested $1 million in Theranos from the early days, and again he had relied on Holmes for information. He said he was impressed with the board, impressed with the fact that Theranos had connections with Big Pharma, and that projections of $200 million in revenues that he was told about were very far from the mark. Okay, so that's it. Don't forget that these are still prosecution witnesses at the moment. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification button so that you don't miss out on any future videos when they are published.